So welcome everybody. This is Dr. Craig Weiner, and this is Transformational Dialogues, Change Your Mind. And, you know, I always say that I have one of the greatest jobs in the world, and today's a perfect example of that because I get to have conversations with the type of people that are asking the questions that I believe most need to be asked and are engaging in that conversation. And today we're going to pick that up with Larry Dossey. And Dr. Larry Dossey, just for those of you that don't know and need a little introduction, is an internal medicine physician, former chief of staff of the Medical City Dallas Hospital. He's a former co-chairman of the panel on mind-body interventions for the National Center of Complementary and Alternative Medicine at the National Institute of Health. He's currently the executive director of the peer-reviewed journal Explorer, the Journal of Science and Healing, which is a wonderful, wonderful peer-reviewed journal that I subscribe to. He's the author of 12 books on the role of consciousness and spirituality and health, which have been translated to languages around the world. I had the privilege of interviewing him on the power of premonition, but also has been the author of Healing Words and so many other great books. But most exciting today is that his newest book, the most recent one, is called One Mind, How Our Individual Mind is Part of a Greater Consciousness and Why It Matters. And because he gets to write and do these great things, he gets to lecture around the world on his own with his wife Barbara and lives in Santa Fe, and it's just a real privilege. So enough of my speaking. Larry, how are you today?
Well, I'm great, Craig. It's nice to join you again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And like you said, snug as a bug. You got snow in Santa Fe. It's a gorgeous day, so just an opportunity to have a great conversation. Before we move forward, I just want to say the best way to get a hold of you or to find out more information about upcoming appearances and what you're doing, you like the LarryDosseyMD.com, yes?
That's it, right. Thank you.
You're welcome. LarryDosseyMD.com. Okay, One Mind. This is a big one. I guess what I'd like to say first is after reading this, I was just profoundly impressed by the degree of transparency, vulnerability, personal sharing of your own life, and it seems like this book is a fruition of the life you've lived. Am I hearing that accurately? Is it just kind of what was next to be said? How did you come to this book at this time?
Well, it's I guess I could call it an autobiography because there's so much personal stuff in there. I just simply wanted to get a lot of things out on the table and in print on the page that have been gestating actually for decades. This is my 12th book, and it's sort of a summation of the things that I began to write about even as early as the 1980s when my first book, Space, Time, and Medicine, was written. So I guess I could say, Craig, that it's just sort of an update on everything that's happened in my life and my journey and my path up until the present time.
I get that. I love that. Thank you so much for being willing to share that. For those of you that don't really know a lot about this, the title or the book, it just recently came out last month. Let's start off with this. I want to make a distinction between what you refer to as the one mind and one mind moments, and people have ideas or have maybe heard of it as the collective unconscious, the Akashic records, the cosmic soup, the field. Why don't you just share a little bit about, for you, what you mean and spoke more fully about in the book of One Mind, what that is?
Well, for me, it's the one mind is a way that consciousness has of manifesting when it goes beyond any confinable limit. When one mind appears to be without boundaries and behaves in a way where you clearly can't put it in a box like the brain or the body and keep it there, then it appears to be boundless and without any demarcations. If that is so, then it just makes sense that in some dimension the one mind, the individual minds come together and form a connected unity in which all minds participate. I mean, I just think this is just cold, hard logic. If something can't be restricted, then it blends with other things of its own kind. This is what we see with consciousness. And the entire book is devoted to exploring not just people's experiences of being united and at one with everything, which is probably the most generic mystical experience in the history of the human race. But also, this one-mind idea comes out of an increasing number of experiments that have been done over the years, which show that there are no boundaries to consciousness. I think that the model of the one mind is just a natural extension of all of that evidence. You are quite correct that the model is not new. It goes back for thousands of years. The Akashic Records was a model which affirmed this. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious would fit also. But the reason I like the one mind is because it's just so simple. It sort of escapes, I think, a lot of the religious baggage that has accumulated around this idea over the ages. And I just think it's a refreshing modern way to look at it.
And a one-mind moment, an experience of that, that maybe from your personal experience or that you've heard repeatedly, you know, a lot of people can tell you what, for example, especially nowadays, a near-death experience might feel like. What might a one-mind moment feel like or be like?
Well, I think everybody has either experienced a one-mind moment or is on the verge of it. Actually, it's interesting. I just got an email today from an airline pilot who flies the big jets that we take from time to time, and he told me about his one-mind moment. He said that he was minding his own business, reading a book, which he didn't disclose, but all of a sudden he had what sounds like many people call an epiphany. He said all of a sudden he just felt himself getting really warm all over, and he felt this sense of being connected with everything there was in the universe. And this guy is, you know, airline pilots aren't noted for being very woo-woo and undisciplined, and he said this was one of the most majestic experiences he's ever had in his life. It's a classic one-mind experience. These things usually happen not to people who are having near-death experiences. They usually occur to people who are quite healthy. And this just was a very typical example that many people have. And so the one-mind moment is just a sense of being at one with all there is. And there's something else that this pilot said, which is just classic. This sense of being connected with everything there is usually marinated in a sense of profound love and compassion. So there you have it. You know, there are a million iterations and nuances of this, but that's basically the skeleton of what a one-mind experience is.
Well, let me break it down a little bit. So I think many people, if I were somebody else listening to you, can sense that what many people may call an interconnectedness between all living things, a way of feeling connected in a moment of experiencing that interconnectedness. But that's a little different. You bring in the word mind and consciousness, which seems maybe not different. In other words, that somehow, you know, whether we're looking at the work of Rupert Sheldrake or ideas Bruce Lipton and other people have spoken about, that there's a memory, there's a consciousness, there's some collective space in which we can tap into for information, for knowledge, and that's different than just feeling connected vibrationally or however you want to describe that. So maybe you could tease that and describe that a little bit.
Yes, I think that one of the implications of the one mind has to do with creativity, and there are many examples in the book I discuss where people appear to retrieve information, if you will, beyond any preparation or prior experience that might explain that. There are many people who have talked about the practical benefits of minds that might come together. One is that you can imagine a pool of information that might be available if all minds cohere and unite and connect. And creative people might just be those individuals who learn how to access that. One example I use in the book is the great inventor, Thomas Edison, whom I quote, said that I never create anything, which is kind of a jaw-dropper because, we all think that he created a bunch of things, including electric motors, the moving pictures, and the phonograph, and electric light bulb, and so on. So it sort of seems outrageous that he would say he never created anything. But what he went on to say is that he gets ideas not from his inner man, but he said ideas come to him from the universe. He said, I get ideas from the outside. And so this idea that creative people can access some dimension that's outside their own inner logic is one that recurs over and over again in people who have become quite famous in science. There's a string of artists and mathematicians and physicists that I quote in the book who believe in this idea of an outside reservoir, if you will, of information that they can learn to tap into. One I talk about in the book is Erwin Schrodinger, who is one of my great heroes in physics. Schrodinger won the Nobel Prize in 1933 for something called the Schrodinger wave equations. And Schrodinger is on record of saying, in truth, there is only one mind. And David Bohm, the great 20th century physicist, said as well that deep down the consciousness of mankind is one. And if we don't see this, he said, we're blinding ourselves to it.
I love first the collection that you draw from, and you mentioned some of the physicists, but you also draw from Emerson and Schopenhauer, and so authors and artists. One is there's a part of me that just wants to know how you collect the information, but I'm going to hold off on that because just that process of interconnecting and drawing those together I find fascinating. But what I wanted to ask more was, there's a way that you were just saying that people speak of, I get my ideas from the universe, that it's not me. And it's almost like there's this ethereal cast-offness and humility about that. But you're taking that a step further and saying it's not just them saying it's not me, please take the attention off me, that there really is some collective way in which this information across time and space is held that we can tap into and sip into and somehow find a way to stop what feels so real and tap into that. And that's very different than just an offhanded, it's not just me.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you bring this up because I want to be clear about this. I'm not talking in terms of a nice poetic expression here, and I'm not talking about a metaphor. I mean this in a very real sense.
Thank you.
Just as those people we just mentioned mean it in a very real sense. Of their being at some invisible dimension, some collection of wisdom or information, call it what you will, that people can access that goes far beyond their own intellectual individual capacities. This is really tough for people in science to do sometimes, however, because we're all obsessed with individual awards and achievements, and the Nobel Prizes are presented to individuals. They don't go to any collective consciousness out there. And so people, are obsessed with individual achievements in the culture, not just in science, but in every other domain of the culture, it seems. And we've made an obsession out of individuality in our culture. Mm-hmm. That's fine as far as it goes, but it obscures the collective features that bring us all together, among which is this idea of a common pool of consciousness that creative people can learn to access. Okay.
So, one of the terms that I love that you used that was very relevant to that was the term collaboratory. All right, that was great. I know it wasn't your words, but you used them well. And the idea of, especially given what we're facing globally right now on so many levels, that we're literally getting to the point that it feels on an individual level there's a helplessness. Because
Absolutely.
any one thing that we do for global warming on an individual level, anything that we do with regard to water, anything that we do with any of the natural resources is not going to be enough, that it's going to take some sort of great collective action and not just a large number of people. It almost feels bigger than that, something that has to turn a tide. And I think that's speaking to what you were just addressing.
I think it does. One of the reasons I wanted to address this idea of a collective unconscious and a unified aspect of who we are is because we do feel helpless currently when we face some of the major challenges that are out there. You know, we can change out our light bulbs all we want and turn down the thermostat, but in the end, it's not going to make the big difference that needs to happen if we're going to confront the major challenges that we face. And the one mind idea is a way out of that sense of helplessness and isolation, because it does multiply far beyond anything arithmetic. I mean, when you talk about the one mind plus another mind is more than two minds. I mean, this is an exponential alchemical sort of thing. It's not purely arithmetically additive. I think that pooled minds are the way to go here. It certainly helps us get out of our sense of isolation and helplessness, and it also spurs us to action. One way that works is that there's no evidence that consciousness is limited to human beings. I think it involves any sentient creature, and the one mind helps us sense a connectedness with all sentient life. If we do that, we're more likely to love all of life on Earth and not confine our compassion just to other human beings, as valuable as that may be. And so it spurs us to action. As the novelist Alice Walker said, anything we love can be saved. And so the question for us currently in our challenges ecologically and environmentally is, how much do we love it? How much are we willing to do in order to preserve it? And I think that the one mind opens the door to greater activity than any of us can muster as long as we're feeling isolated and working alone.
You know, in that response, you spoke of alchemical nature, you spoke of love, you spoke of some very, obviously, critical issues. I also want to juxtapose that to your physician. You know, you're the editor and publisher of a significant scientific journal. And on one hand, we're having not consciousness research, but a lot of brain research emerging on so many levels. How, you used the term, just to kind of inquire into that a little bit, what was it, the pathological disbelief of scientists. And we speak of this kind of scientific arrogance, like we know the way things are, we're in inquiry, but that inquiry is still sometimes within a box, isn't it? So how do we address the importance of love, of this collaboration, of this alchemical nature of things, and still be able to have science be relevant in that inquiry?
Well, I think we need to do something to make it more feasible for scientists to come out of the closet and really stop posturing about the absence of the importance of love and compassion and what goes on in this world. I happen to be very interested in some of the surveys that have gone on among physicians nationwide about what they really believe about how connected they are and the importance of love and compassion and the everyday practice of medicine and surgery. As it turns out, if you ask physicians privately on surveys where they don't have to sign their name and, you know, confess having done this, you'll be surprised about what they say. Surveys now show that the vast majority of physicians actually pray for their patients privately, and the question is, why do they do this? Well, for one thing, I think they believe in the power of prayer. In the second place, they feel compassionate and loving enough and caring enough for their patients that they're willing to go an extra mile to do that. But, you know, when I was in medical school, and I think I speak for most physicians, none of this was emphasized. The idea that love could make a difference in the clinical response of a patient just never came up. And even today, talking about the importance of loving compassion really isn't the very best way to go about advancing your career in medicine. You know, your colleagues look at you funny, and you may not get that next grant application approved, and, you know, tenure may be denied you if you talk this way. But in their private hearts, a lot of doctors really are quite open to the importance of their deep connectedness with their patients and their love for them. I've gone out on a limb on a series of books in trying to stand up for the importance of love and compassion and healing. And there's every reason to do this, Craig, because the studies that have been done in laboratories now, looking at the ability of people to reach out and connect with other individuals non-locally and at a distance, is facilitated by a mutual experience of love. There isn't a better word for this. There's no sense in denying it because we see its importance in the laboratory. So I'm saying to my colleagues and anybody who will listen, can we just drop the pretense here and call this by what it is? You can, you know, dress it up and talk about non-local connectedness and whatever, but it boils down to a sense of sentience and compassion and love. I think we see this, you know, in all of those one-mind moments and one-mind experiences that we were talking about a moment ago. It's not just a sense of connectedness that people experience and are transformed by. The other thread is the sense of profound love that comes with that sense of unity.
Yeah. No, that's beautifully said. You know, a question, being a chiropractor in the healing arts for 20-something years now, the question that keeps arising for me that I want to explore with you a little bit is, you didn't go into a lot of detail with the specifics of any healing experience. Yet, my question is, what is the responsibility, or what is the best way of holding for anybody in the healing professions? What's happening when they're working with a client or patient in healing? Is it basically that we're creating a space, do you think, in which they can tap their one mind, that collectively we're looking, whether it be placebo, whether it be our words, whether it be the safe space that we're creating, what is it that may happen that would best allow for a healing to happen using this concept of one mind in your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the great premises of healing, whether in your field of chiropractic or mine in internal medicine or anything in between, has to do with this sense that they're not two isolated people here, patient and physician, who are trying to meet somewhere. There's a meeting that has already taken place. The connection is innate. We don't have to manufacture that. It comes factory installed. There are levels where we come together that are invisible and probably subconscious. So we don't have to make that connection happen when we're dealing with patients. It's already there. But there's something else we can do, I think, that helps activate it. My favorite word is intentionality. It is an act of conscious wishing, wanting, willing a certain outcome, and then stepping aside, putting the ego away, and letting that happen, if it will. This is all very mysterious. We don't have a language even to discuss what may happen. But another word, I think, that fits what's happening here is the word non-locality. Healing isn't some squiggly vibration that goes from point A to point B. In spite of, all of our talk about energy and vibrations and all of this, nothing is transferred in non-local connections. It's already present. And so we need to, I think, simply get out of the way with our heavily intellectualized models and simply put ourselves in a place and ask that to happen. a lot of people that I've talked to in the healing business learn how to do that with certain attitudes toward prayer. One that I like, and I bumped into over and over when I was writing books about the evidence that prayer does something to change the world, was the attitude and strategies that people have when they pray. One that I particularly found to be effective is where people, healers, simply don't ask for the cancer to go away or anything, the heart attack to heal or anything like that. They don't ask for anything specific. They simply ask something like, may the best outcome prevail here.
Right.
They step aside and they stop trying to tell the world what to do. They stop trying to micromanage the outcome of the clinical interchange. I think that's lovely. It is a way of appealing to a higher wisdom than our own, and it's a way, I think, of tapping into the pool of information that is constituted by the one mind that you and I were talking about a moment ago.
Well, on one hand, I think it's lovely, but I have to bring up the 180-degree opposite attitude of science and allopathic and most types of medicine and healing paradigms that basically, especially in allopathic medicine, say, look, I'm the one that has to figure this out. I'm the one that has to come up with the best treatment paradigm. You are here seeking my counsel and my wisdom and my experience to be able to bring the best way to fix this. And now you're saying, well, I don't really know what the best outcome is, and let's just leave it up. I mean, this is difficult and challenging, I would say, for most people coming from that paradigm.
Well, I think you're right. I don't want to be misunderstood on this. I am one who strongly favors doctors and healers and of all sorts acquiring technical skills. I mean, I've had some significant surgery in my time, and I sought out what I thought was one of the most well-trained, technically expert surgeons I could find. You know, if I wanted a brain tumor removed surgically, I wouldn't go to a shaman here in northern New Mexico. I would go to a neurosurgical institute. I would also love to have a neurosurgeon, however, who was keyed into the things that we were talking about a moment ago.
Right.
I think that it's a mistake to paint ourselves into a corner and say, I'm just going to do this all with non-local healing and love and compassion and forget about the technical competence. I think in modern days we need both, and I think they're both a blessing.
Agreed. So perhaps really what we're aiming for is some compendium, some people call it left brain, right brain, but that skillfulness and that wisdom, but also that allowing for the lack of arrogance that we don't know what the best path is for this person here.
Well, I think that there's a lot to say for that. I also want to emphasize that there are healings that happen in the complete absence of anybody who's technically competent like you or me. I have a string of cases in my file drawers of diseases that just simply happen to go away. This is almost an embarrassment to people whose training is highly technical and mechanical and so on. But those things happen. People are always sending me case histories where horrible diseases just vanished with no input whatsoever from anything that we would call modern medicine. So this is part of the mystery. It would be nice to know how to engineer those kinds of clinical responses, but we don't know how to manipulate those and call them forth at will, but they happen. And it suggests that there are innate healing capacities in the human body that we just simply don't understand. I hope we do one of these days.
I love the idea that you brought in the seeking for that connection and the seeking for that one-minded experience, for example. That effort almost gets in the way. And maybe you could address that, and I know in my personal experience, it's like the harder you want to recreate, or somebody's had an experience and they want it again, or they're seeking to, they've read this book and they want to have one of those experiences. It's like the harder you reach for it, the further away it gets. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that's a very good way to put it. Aldous Huxley called this the law of reversed effort, and it's exactly what you just said. The harder you try to acquire it, the farther it recedes from you. So at some point, a lot of people in frustration simply give up on their spiritual journey. They've tried to have an experience of an epiphany or satori or enlightenment for 20 or 30 years, and it hasn't been successful. And they find out that when they quit trying, the magic happens. I think there is a place where we can go, where we put our rational minds to rest and put the ego aside and simply let things be. I think this is crucial because as we've said already, you don't have to engineer this. It's already intrinsic. It's inherent in us. And so we have to set the stage for it and invite it to happen as opposed to trying to make it and force it to happen. I really like what Angie Arian says, what she calls the 4 rules of life, which capture this approach. The first rule is show up. The second rule is pay attention. The third rule is tell the truth. And then the fourth rule is the hardest of all. Don't be attached to results. Mm-hmm. And it's in that fourth rule, I think, that a lot of people trip themselves up. It's really hard to be unattached and simply to get into a place where you just really are willing to go with the flow. But it's in those kinds of moments when the magic often happens. If you read the literature of epiphanies, most of them happen when people are just doing nothing. They happen at the sink washing dishes, while you're gardening and have your garden mind, just occupied with nothing in particular. Then this sort of one-mind experience can just explode out of nowhere and actually transform people's way of being in the world.
Well, let me make it personal and relevant then. So let's just say, for you, you're a scholarly man. You've written the books that you've written, or let's say you're about to write another book. You're about to give a presentation. On one hand, there's the skillfulness of being able to do the research, of being able to cull information. Do you now find yourself sometimes stopping that intrinsic thrust to that doing, and just stopping and somehow being able to tap into internally information, knowing, trusting? How is that for you, that process now, combining those two?
Well, it's something I've really had to confront, because every issue of the journal Explore, I have to contribute, a lengthy editorial on some topic. And I've learned over the years, I've been doing this almost 20 years, writing an editorial every couple of months. I usually have no idea what the heck it is that I want to write about. And I can get into a snit. I'm very good at that, where I really get tensed up and anxious. The deadline's coming, and, I have yet to produce anything. So I've learned over 20 years to trust some process that I don't have control of. In 20 years, this has not failed me yet. It's a pretty good track record. Something always shows up, and it usually shows up when I quit trying to find it. An idea will pop into my mind that I can just simply run with, and I've learned to trust that. I've just published a big book, and my thoughts are turning to a next book, and I don't have any idea what I'm going to produce in the next book, but I know I will. And it's that sort of process that comes close to this not paying attention to results.
I laugh, Larry, just because it's so present for me. I know exactly the deadline for my newsletter is coming up, and I should have collected ideas through the month, and then finally you don't have any time left except you have to sit down and start writing. And then you just let go of, I don't know what I'm going to write about, and all of a sudden something that happened to you that morning. Or I was unprepared for a lecture I was giving the other night, and having just been off your book, basically I channeled you. And and it went perfectly. But what I love about that idea is if we can accept that we have that skill or that ability, then we're going to basically run anti-anxiety medications, down the tube, because it's that anxiousness of I'm not going to know, I'm not going to be able to handle it. But if we can begin to come to that place of, when I need to, I will, and that trust and faith place of knowing that you know how to that you've dipped that straw into that cosmic soup so many times that it will come, and I can either stress about it or I can just trust.
Well, exactly right, and we can get bent out of shape about it because, I think, what if I can't write the next editorial? I mean, am I going to get dismissed? Am I going to embarrass myself and my colleagues? But I've learned to just stop that, and just sort of go with the flow and not be attached to the result and stop trying to force it. I mean, that's the deadly thing, I think.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. And that information, we're not the first ones doing it. And so if we can draw from other people that collective sense, right, in our lives, and I don't know if, I'm in my young 50s, I know you got a few years on me, but I think that there is that coming to stillness and trusting the ability to get the information when you need to. That reduces a lot of the stress that people have.
There's some examples in the book I used that emphasize this idea that when we talk about a pool of wisdom or information that's out there that we can access, again, we're not exaggerating. We're not talking metaphors or poetry here. One of my favorite examples in the book happened to famous author Joseph Chilton Pearce, who wrote several books. I guess the best known are The Cosmic Egg and The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. These were written back in the 80s, I think, and 90s. And at any rate, he had an experience when he was a young university professor, and he was obsessed, as he said, by his exploration of the relationship between God or the Absolute and humankind. And he said he was reading a lot of Carl Jung's psychology and philosophy, and he was sitting on his bed early one morning preparing for a college lecture when his 5-year-old son came in and sat down on the edge of the bed and launched into a 20-minute tutorial about the connection between God and humankind. And Pearce said that he spoke in complete sentences with sophisticated language and a monotone and words that could have been published in any journal. He said that his son told him everything there was to know about the topic, and then he broke into tears, and he said he got his hair stood on end, and he knew that he was in the presence of the uncanny. And so the little boy's ride came, the car honked, so he went up and went to kindergarten, and the little boy had no recall of this whatsoever. But Pearce did, and it changed his life. He said he followed the trajectory of his son's talk for the next few decades, but it would be until he was in his 50s, immersed in intense meditation, before he came to any understanding that was close to what his son on that morning disclosed to him. And so the question is, how does that happen? Where does the kid get the information? He's 5. And so, we can ignore those kinds of examples if we wish, but I think there's real gold there. If we can understand what happens in that sort of thing, I think I think those things point like an arrow to this idea of a non-corporeal body of information that can be accessed even by children.
Yeah. Well, that actually brings up the whole idea of age and time and, your thoughts even on being able to go back to acquire information, maybe that hasn't been written, for example, back in time, but it also brings future time. And that, that non-linearity of time, that we still have access somehow to the past and future. Can you give me some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I am very much attracted to the idea that we can access the future and know things before they even happen. My previous book, which you and I discussed on your program, I guess a couple of years ago, was called The Power of Premonitions. And premonitions are really the ability to understand something before it takes place. There's profound evidence, not just from people's experiences, but from experiments that have been done in the laboratory, which show that people can access and respond to information before it even occurs. There's a series of experiments called Presentiment Experiments by pioneer Dr. Dean Radin and many other people by now, which show that we can unconsciously respond in the autonomic nervous system to stressful events that are going to happen before a computer even selects them. So this idea that we might be able to access information in the future is no longer hypothetical or conjectural. It's been proven. I think that this plays into the idea of the one mind, which has no limits, not just in space, but also no limits in time. And one of the reasons I think this is a crucial aspect of the one mind is that it suggests immortality. Because what we mean by immortality is infinitude in time. And so these ideas that we can access information before it happens show profoundly, in my judgment, that time is not linear. We're not locked into the present. There's some aspect of who we are that can go beyond the confinement of time, just as we can go beyond confinement in space.
And not only time and space, but across many dimensions. You bring in wonderful stories, just to give the listeners other ideas of where you go in the book, of cross-knowledge between species, between humans and animals, between beings. I loved your chapter and your personal sharing about twins, separated at birth and yet led parallel lives. Amazing animal stories. So it just, every time you get comfortable perhaps with one level of remote viewing perhaps, and then it expands to another level between sentient beings, and then another level of savants that do things that we can't even understand how the brain power can do that. And so I just love how you keep taking that box and expanding it further with all the different chapters too.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm very much attracted to the idea of one mind expanding beyond human beings to envelop any living creature. I'm a dog lover, and I love Rupert Sheldrake's experiments, which show that dogs can know when their owners are beginning to return home in uncanny ways. I mean, it just seems that this idea of limitless mind is not confined to human beings, but is displayed by almost any sentient creature. I quote Mark Twain as to the dog issues. He got into a conversation once with people about the afterlife, and someone brought up whether or not there's an afterlife for dogs. And Twain said, well, I don't know, but if dogs don't go to heaven, I want to go where they go.
Well said.
My sentiments exactly.
Well said. It's an interesting time right now, just with authors and in the world. even Alexander's book of the neurosurgeon's book of near-death, after-death experience, et cetera, however you want to refer to it.
Right.
And so we're seeing authors like yourself, like Dr. Alexander, on one hand, the pinnacle of science, being the ones leading the way right now to the esoteric, experiential, spiritual, physical interface. And I think that is really exciting.
Well, I
Don't
think
you?
it is too. Absolutely. I, as a physician, have for a long time been concerned about how we try to put things in a box and say this is physical and this is spiritual, and if you're concerned about something spiritual, go see the priest or minister or somebody. Don't go to the physician or the scientist. But I think that those restrictions are really artificial. One reason I say that is because of the healing experiments, which show that prayer and healing intentions can operate at a distance in people, even when they don't know it's being applied to them. And also the profound evidence that people who live a spiritual life, and it doesn't seem to matter which spiritual path they pick, but if they pick one and stick to it and are disciplined by it, they live on average 7 to 13 years longer than people who don't. And they have a lower incidence of heart disease and cancer and just about any disease you want to pick. So it's gotten to the point where it is dangerous. It can be lethal to separate spirituality from physical health. And that's just, I think, evidence that what you just said is really true. There's no point any longer in trying to live segmented lives and be rational on one hand and intuitive on the other. That is not good for our health, and to say nothing to the point that it makes us more unhappy and fearful in this life. So we need to get around that. I think we are trying to eliminate the intellectual indigestion over these issues in our medical schools. Most of them these days have courses looking at the correlations between spiritual practice and physical health, and I would just say I think it's about time.
Yeah, that's good. What is your greatest hope right now? So with this book influencing people, maybe you already have readers that are in your side pocket that are cheering you on, and they're on your side already, but perhaps there'll be people that start to read this book or influenced by it. And what would be your greatest hope that happens as a result of it for people and for culture?
I hope people can learn to go beyond the isolation of the individual. The reason I say that is that unless we learn to do that, I think we're sunk on this planet. I don't think we're going to be able to meet the challenges that are absolutely profound. So that it requires some shift in the way we conceive who we are. So I think that this idea of the one mind is the best, one of the best hopes we have of survival. So I know that's big talk, and those are crucial issues that some people think are not appropriate to address philosophically or spiritually or psychologically. But I think unless we do, we're not going to be able to meet the challenges. I'm an optimist about it. I had an opportunity to talk to the great physicist David Bohm once, and I asked him, Professor Bohm, do you think we're going to make it? And he thought long and hard, and finally he said, yes, Larry, we're going to make it, barely. So I hope this book can help us make it, barely. And I'm convinced that if we're able to really feel in our heart and our gut the truth behind our connectedness, it's going to make us happier and more fulfilled and wiser, and I would even say healthier, to say nothing of helping us stay alive on this planet, which is the only home we have.
Right. Larry, this has been a pleasure. I could do this for hours, but I want to respect your time, and I look forward to listeners getting the book and reading it. Can I get it through your website, or should they go to the local Barnes & Noble or their local bookseller in their town? What would you most like?
Yeah, we want to support our local booksellers, but there's a link on my website that you could click through, and it's available widely in bookstores around the country.
Great. So I guess with that, I just want to remind people that's at LarryDosseyMD.com. If you would like to listen to the last interview with Dr. Dossey or with other people in his book from John Graham and Stephen Schwartz and Dean Radin, you can go to transformationaldialogues.com or on Facebook, Transformational Dialogues. And I just appreciate your listening. I hope that, more than just reading, that you get a sense of Larry, because he comes out even richer and more wonderful than in words alone. So Larry, thank you for your time. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much. Best wishes.
All right. Take care. Best of art.